Chris Leithner, you're in this world. How do you feel about the decision not to sell the Australian Stock Exchange to Singapore?
Well,
or don't you even care?
I do care. If there were strict property rights in this country, which there are not, this would simply be a matter between the owners of the Australian Securities Exchange, namely its shareholders, and the owners of the Singaporean exchange, namely its shareholders. The one makes an offer for the property of the other. If the price is high enough, if the terms and conditions are advantageous, then all well and good. And if not, then the sale doesn't proceed. The trouble, though, is that there are, let's call them third parties, who can impose themselves, who can coerce, who have clubs in their hands, and who say, no, never mind your best interests as you see them, owners of the Australian Securities Exchange. We know better. And so we're going to block the sale. It's as if you decide to sell your house and you decide, look, the terms and conditions are fine. It's a bank check. The check is going to all these sorts of things. But someone in the next suburb says, no, you can't sell the house. You'd be quite properly, you'd be a bit upset by that to say, what is it your business? This is a private matter between a buyer and a seller. Please butt out. Or if you're that concerned about the sale of my house, you can make a better offer to me. Thanks very much. So I say to the government, if the government is that concerned about the various sorts of furphies they've flown up, they can make an offer that's better than the Singaporean offer to the owners of the ASC. Of course, they haven't done that. Why? Because, well, coercion is their name of the game. They simply say no, and that's the end of the story.
So you do feel strongly about it?
I guess I do.
It's in the nation's interest, though, to keep your own stock exchange.
The national interest is a fraudulent sort of a concept. We'll talk perhaps a bit this later on. Individual people have interests. You know your interests better than anyone else.
Yep.
I hopefully know my interest. You and your wife collectively, vicariously know the interest of your child better than any other parent. And quite properly, you feel umbrage when people say, no, Steve Austin, I'm sorry, your best interests are these. The phrase national interest is basically a fraud by which a politician can step in and do things which civilized people couldn't do if it's over the back garden fence.
I love it when you come in, Chris.
You asked me the question, I gave you an answer. You'll know better next time.
My guest is Chris Leithner from Leithner and Associates. You would recall that Chris is an occasional finance commentator for the evening program. He's written a new book, which is, I think, your second or third book, Chris Leithner.
Second, basically.
Second book, okay. The book is called The Evil Princes of Martin Place, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Global Financial Crisis and the Threat to Australians' Liberty and Prosperity. And Chris Leithner is my up-close and personal guest tonight. And he comes in on a night when the nation's economists were essentially lamenting that Australians are saving too much money because it's slowing down the economy because you're not spending. Now, I know Chris has had a bit to say about this in the past, so I won't raise it with him. I won't give you the opportunity now. But give me a little bit of your background, Chris Leithner, first of all. You were born and raised in Canada, is that right?
I was indeed, in a city called Winnipeg, which is renowned around the world for possibly having the best climate on the face of the earth.
Winnipeg, Manitoba?
That's correct.
Okay. The only thing I know about Winnipeg, I think, from memory, is that the wonderful 70s rock band, the Guess Who, came from there, I think, didn't they?
The Guess Who, Burton Cummings, Neil Young. There's, depending upon your taste in music, whether it's a good or a bad place. But yes, there's a list of folks who typically were born there and now live somewhere else, possibly because of the world's greatest climate.
Right. Okay. So what was life like growing up in Winnipeg? Manitoba,
well,
Canada.
You've caught me on the hop here, I suppose.
Good. I want to know who you are as a person, Chris Leithner.
Is a middle-class existence, I'm thinking off the hop, is a middle-class existence whether you come from Perth or from Winnipeg or from Middlesbrough in the UK. Mm-hmm. That's to say, relative to probably, 80-90% of the population, you are incomparably better off, but as a kid you haven't the slightest idea about the extent to which you're better off. Things which you take for granted, others would regard as utterly and completely unimaginable. Did
you have Canadian Indians or Inuit in your neighbourhood?
Winnipeg's an interesting place for several reasons, and yes, there's an Aboriginal population. There is a distinct group called Métis, which are partly Aboriginal, partly depending upon either French or English-speaking, which form what's called a distinct nation. There is a French-speaking quarter to the city, a very heavy Eastern European, Ukrainian, Polish contingent, a very heavy German and Austrian contingent. So whilst the word wasn't used that often, there's what Australians might call a multicultural aspect to the place.
Where did you go to school?
Oh, goodness me, a standard sort of middle-class I'm in a sense amazed that you answer that it's a kind of a vanilla sort of an upbringing.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Did you went to university where?
In Montreal. That's a bit more interesting.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay. So, and I asked this question because I think there's something to Professor Manning Clark's statement once that the puzzles of childhood become the quests of adulthood. In other words, those formative childhood moments. There are certain events in childhood that often seem to direct a person's path or influence a person's path later on in life. Was there one for you? Was there a moment in life for you?
Oh, golly.
Not that you can recall.
Not that comes immediately to mind, I suppose, for being a bit contrarian, a bit revisionist. Montreal was interesting for me in ways that are very different from perhaps 99% of the population. Yes, it's a bicultural city in the sense that there's an English-speaking minority, a French-speaking majority. Mm-hmm. What interested me, how to summarize it in a sentence, that roughly from the mid-18th century, roughly from 1750, 1760 to well into the 19th century, it was the center of the world's fur trade, or at least the North American center, with London being the European center, and arguably from about 1760 to 1780, the center of the most important commercial city in North America, more important than Philadelphia, more important than New York. And I suppose that's something that's disappeared in the intervening close to 200 years, but an interesting the center of a commercial empire. And arguably, as if you like, the cradle of Canada in that commercial sort of a sense. I'll wax slightly eloquently here. It was fur traders who explored Canada from east to west. They were in search of commerce. They were in search of furs. The Aborigines were their partners because literally they had the local knowledge. Goods were traded, alas, towards well into the 19th century, alcohol and so on. But the critical point is that commerce made Canada. Compare that to Lewis and Clark, U.S. government employees subsidized by the U.S. government. Imperialism, quite literally, the westward movement of the government was the motivating force there. So whilst Mackenzie, on the basis of commerce, was the first European who saw the Arctic Ocean, was the first European who crossed the continent to see the Pacific, it was commerce, the joys of profit, the importance of profit, the civilizing aspect of profit and commerce, as opposed to Americans, for which it was imperialism. For the fur trade, Aborigines were a partner. You couldn't have a fur trade without the folks with the local knowledge. Quite literally, they were in the way in the United States, and therefore eventually came close to extermination.
So that's very revealing to me at that point. So commerce created Canada from your point of view.
From my point of view, and from the point of view of a lot of
economic history. And involved local indigenous populations as an equal partner in that.
Equal is stretching it. But certainly they were vitally important because they had the local knowledge. What I'm getting at is that the stereotypes of Canada in the U.S., it seems to me, are the polar opposite of the historical truth.
Thank you.
Americans will wax long and hard about their allegedly limited government, about their commerce and so on. And again, I'll use the phrase, it's a fraud from top to bottom. Another point is that we hear it relentlessly in this country and from it. There weren't 13 colonies in 1776, count them. There were 17 colonies in 1776. The excitable population of the 13 invaded Canada not once in 1776, not twice in 1778, 79 or thereabouts, but 3 times also in 1812, each time repulsed. For them in the name of liberty and democracy, but repulsed each time. And my final point, since you've got me on a roll here, is that the allegedly freedom and liberty-loving Americans are about a third of the population of those 13 colonies. The famous phrase was, we're going to trade 3,000 tyrants a mile away from home for a single tyrant 3,000 miles away in London. No, thanks very much. That's a bit silly. For their trouble, they were dispossessed of their property and forcibly removed from the country. So what I'm getting at is, you ask about sort of background and informative sorts of things. When I hear things coming out of Washington, when I hear Australian prime ministers, for heaven's sakes, talking to U.S. Congress, she's spilling, she's talking utterly and completely, she's talking historical nonsense, that the stereotypes are the polar opposite, that Americans wax eloquently about all manner of things, but the historical fact, it seems to me, and I've even spoken about African Americans and so on, but we'll leave that one aside as possibly the most egregious element of the fraud.
Well, this to me, Chris Leithner, is very revealing because it explains something about you of why you're an adherent to very pure free market ideas, almost theology, if you like, and have been so critical of American imperialism as you see it. So explain to me, if you've just tuned in, this is 612 ABC Brisbane, ABC Local Radio Queensland, ABC Digital Coast FM and more. It's 9:22. My guest is financier Chris Leithner. He's written the book The Evil Princes of Martin Place. and I'm going to ask him a little bit about that in just a moment. But you adhere to what's known as the Austrian School of Economics. As a simple, give me the dummy's guide to what is the Austrian School of Economics. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but just a dot point, just so the listener knows where you're coming from.
Right. It's not a branch of economics, but it's a completely different way, a distinct way of conceiving not just economics, but the entire social order. What do we mean by Austrian? Well, the originators of the school, a fellow Karl Menger in the 19th century, in 1871 authored a book called Principles of Economics. In the simplest possible terms, it seems to me the guts of it, the phrase, a bit of jargon, methodological individualism. Governments don't act, committees don't act, only individuals act. There's a point I raised before in the interview. Yes. You raised my hackles. Each individual
very
person
effectively, I thought.
Subjectively knows his or her interests, desires, wants, hopes, aspirations better than the next person. Parents know vicariously for their small kids and so on. How do they act upon those preferences? Well, to do so peacefully, you have a choice either to do so peacefully or non-peacefully. In a peaceful way is given very strict property rights. You own what you own, I own what I own. There's a boundary. Good fences make good neighbours. We make offers to one another. I'll offer to sell this to you or buy such and such from you. It's up to you whether to accept or not to accept. But all matter.
So I'm free to exchange according to how I see in my best interests.
As you see in your best interest. Now, you might make mistakes. You might not. The point, though, is that when third parties intervene, namely politicians, governments, and so on, in economic, financial, and in a moral sense, all manner of unattractive things arise. So that's where the point of let people do what they want to do, with the absolutely critical caveat that they do it peacefully, that they're not stealing each other's property, they're not aggressing against each other, but basically the individual makes his or her own decision and, critically, lives with the consequences.
After the global financial crisis, there have been a number of books written and now a Oscar-winning documentary called Inside Job. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it looks at the global financial crisis in the United States. And one thing that came out of it that surprised me is that of all of the fraud that was revealed in the global financial crisis, not a single person has been charged with any crime. And in fact, all of the old players are not only still in power, they were rewarded for their actions. That surprised me, but this is the reason, essentially, for the writing of your book. So let's go through some dot points. Why was the global financial crisis a failure of government and not a failure of the market or of capitalism, Chris Leithner?
Three things. Financial crises, particularly those that turn into economic crises, three things cause them. First of all, the government monopolizes, by force, the definition and the production of money. If left to our own devices, as it was in the past, we'd come up with our own a commodity-based definition of money, typically having to do with the weight of gold. But we don't live in that sort of a world because the government now imposes its own view upon us. So the first reason, notice this has nothing to do with markets, everything to do with the government. This is what money is. You shall accept it in your trade. And you don't have, in other words, they're intervening between these two people. This is a definition. We are the sole producers of these banknotes, etc., and you have no choice in the matter. So that's reason one. Secondly, the existence and the actions of commercial banks, fully backed by the state's laws. And then thirdly, the central bank, which is completely a creature of the state and not of the market. So those three things we can discuss in more detail, how they interact and whatnot. But all these three things have nothing whatsoever to do with the voluntary interactions of buyers and sellers, but everything to do with the violent intervention of government into those actions of buyers and sellers.
Governments tried to intervene, though, to civilise the brutal aspects of trade when some players become big and some players become impoverished, don't they?
That's what they say.
They try and level the playing field, balance the scales.
They try, it seems to me, to do what's best for them, just as individuals act, you and I as individuals act in our best interest. With a politician, you find, or as the head of the government, you have the monopoly of the so-called legalized use of force, and you're going to exercise that. So if it's the case that people are greedy, and we have evidence going back to the Old Testament that they are, if it's the case that politicians are people, then it's logically inescapable the conclusion that politicians too are greedy. that bureaucrats too are greedy? Do we seriously think that once one becomes a civil servant, once one walks into a government building, a halo sprouts over your head and suddenly altruism and good cheer among men suddenly reigns? You talk about the public interest, but again, that's just the naked self-interest of politicians and bureaucrats.
Your book highlights how the example of 1907, 100 years ago, a little bit over 100 years ago, was repeated in the global financial crisis. In simple terms, how? What happened?
Okay, well, let's draw an analogy.
Because if things are repeating themselves, that's indicative of something fundamentally wrong with what we're doing at the moment.
That's right. The things have always, for the past century at least, and significantly longer, have been wrong. Let's say that you and your wife decide you're going to the symphony. Okay? You drive close to the concert hall, and you decide you're going to leave your car with a valet at a garage. Okay? You step out of your car, you hand the valet the keys, and for the sake of argument, $50. And the contract, in effect, between the two of you is that the valet has taken the keys in the car that you and your wife go to enjoy the symphony. The valet is going to park the car, safeguard the car. When you return, he's given you a ticket. Forgot to mention that you have a piece of paper in your pocket now. Upon demand, you hand your little slip of paper, your ticket, to the valet. He'll go back into the bowels of the garage, extract your car, and you drive home. In other words, you've exchanged $50 for safekeeping services of an indeterminate amount of time. Okay. Fine print, by the way, you can claim your car anytime you like. If you decide after the first act of the symphony you don't like the music or your wife doesn't like it, come back, grab your car. After the concert, you return to the garage and you find that the valet has lent your car to some third party. And he says, I don't know when they're going to be back. Probably it's not going to be until tomorrow sometime. You're going to be a bit upset by that.
Yes.
That violates the contract that you've made with the valet and the garage. You've deposited your car in good faith. You've given him the $50, right? You've upheld your end of the contract, but the valet and the garage clearly haven't. In other words, without your permission, they've misappropriated your property. It's yours.
Yes.
You didn't cede ownership to them.
Yes.
You simply paid them for safekeeping services. The problem, of course, is that your car, physically, it's impossible. It can't be in two places at once. Right?
Yes.
Okay. This third-party borrower can't possess it at the same time that you're driving home with your wife.
Yes.
Now, why do I raise this analogy? Because the basics of banking, whether it's in 1907 or in 2007 when the crisis began, is almost identical. Let's say, as an example, you deposit money in the bank. You put it in a check account, on the implicit understanding that you can write a check or front up at the ATM or in a teller and withdraw X amount of banknotes anytime you please. That's the implicit arrangement, is it not? Let's say tomorrow morning, sharp at 10 o'clock when the bank's open, the entire population of Australians who have check accounts seek to exchange their accounts for cash. They're not going to be able to do so. The money simply is not there. Why? Because that not only has that money been lent to other people in the form of mortgages, commercial loans, you name it, they've not only, to add insult to the injury, for every $100 of deposits they have, they retain only about, say, $5 for small-scale sorts of redemptions, but they've lent not $100, but closer to about $800 or $900. Right?
Yes.
They've created a vast amount of, in effect, counterfeit tickets, going back to the analogy I gave to you.
Isn't that called a wealth multiplier? Because the federal government will say, look, we'll underwrite what you're doing because we want the nation to grow and to prosper.
How many more cars are there as a result of this? Harking back to our initial example, they gave you one ticket for your car, but suddenly they've created a dozen tickets. So there's now a dozen Steve Austins competing for the same. Can you say, hang on, I've got the title to that car. The amount of wealth hasn't increased one iota. What there is a great confusion about the ultimate ownership of what wealth does exist. And for the same point, that just as your car cannot exist physically in two places at once, money cannot exist at two places. And it cannot sit in your check account, in a deposit account, and it cannot sit as collateral for a loan simultaneously. So the analogy I'm drawing has to do with the fact that these loans are not properly collateralized. The crisis basically is the fact that we have a confusion about the ownership of property.
So when the global financial crisis happened, because there wasn't collateral to cover the money that was being developed.
There were basically counterfeit tickets created, which could not adequately. It's a bit of like musical chairs. There are 5 chairs and 7 people dancing around. There's going to be some folks that are disappointed when the music stops. We have X amount of confetti, funny money, chasing a considerably small number of real goods and services. So that this is where the counterfeiting notion comes into it. That the crisis is simply the culmination, rendering tangible and real the underlying fraud or the underlying counterfeiting which existed all the way through.
And you argue the crisis is not yet over.
Not yet. No, we're still, in cricketing terms, we might be, say, at drinks on day 2 of a 5-day test, for the simple reason that the initial manifestation of the crisis, bankrupt banks, they'd been bankrupt the whole time, but their bankruptcy had been manifested and made clear to people. Those sorts of errors were swept under governments' rugs, and what we're now seeing is that governments are slowly but surely, people are realizing, oh, hang on, governments too can go bankrupt. Governments, as we speak, are going bankrupt. We've swept problems under the rug.
How do they go bankrupt, Chris Leithner? Because we don't feel the effect of that. We still drive our cars. We still, eat 3 meals a day here in our country.
The government of, whether it's the UK or of Portugal or of Greece or of the US, have made promises to people which they're not going to be able to keep. The definition of bankruptcy being they're not going to be able to
Ireland is certainly in that case.
In the sense that, take the case, typical welfare state, whether it's the USA or Britain, they have made pension promises, pharmaceutical promises, medical promises to people extending decades into the future, and they're not going to be able to make those promises effectively on 100 cents on the dollar because so much of this additional funding money has been created. The purchasing power of those pensions, of those pharmaceutical benefits, of those medical benefits is constantly shrinking.
Now, are we seeing the effect of this? And this is why the American dollar is so weak and the Australian dollar is so strong comparatively against the American dollar.
Well, remember that all currencies...
That markets are saying, no, your dollar is not worth much money.
If it's not tied to a commodity such as gold, if governments can create this funding money in massive amounts, as they've been doing, and this is something that's gone on for decades, the goods and services in Australia that you could buy for $1 or the equivalent of $1 pre-decimalisation in almost exactly a century ago, in 1913, would now cost you $20-something. The eggs, the Granny Smith apples, things which... are identical to what they were a century ago. So in other words, the purchasing power of whether it's the Australian dollar, the US dollar, the pound, you name it, the lira, has been trashed continuously and most aggressively since the Great Depression. So that, yes, some currencies melt a bit more slowly than others. For the past probably 50 years on average, the Australian dollar has melted much more quickly than the US dollar. In the past, say, 2 years, the Aussie dollar has melted less rapidly than the US dollar. But because all of them, in actual fact, are to a considerable extent counterfeit currencies, they're all melting. In other words, the purchasing power is always the goods and services, the quantity of goods and services which you can buy is greater today than it's going to be in the future.
My guest is Chris Leithner, author of The Evil Princes of Martin Place, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Global Financial Crisis, and the Threat to Australia's Liberty and Prosperity. In your book, you say the Reserve Bank of Australia helped the artificial boom and is staving off the genuine bust. What do you mean?
Well, roughly, and I use examples since the early 1990s. Let's take 1991 as kind of a base year. Since then, the RBA has created money vastly in excess of what they call the rate of inflation, the consumer price index. What's that done? It's created asset booms, basically, real estate and stock market booms. By creating funny money, it puts money in the hands of some people before others. How are they going to spend that money? On what objects are they going to spend that money? Well, it depends, again, subjectively. We discussed that a few minutes ago. What's occurred over the past 20 years is what the early recipients of that funny money, they've decided to spend it on things like residential real estate and stocks and bonds, which has created booms in residential real estate, such that Australian residential real estate is amongst the dearest in the Western world, booms on the stock market, and so on.
I think The Economist magazine recently said that Australia's real estate market was 40% overinflated or something.
That order of magnitude. Remember when in my analogy with the valet and parking the car, and once I extended it into banking, I said, look, not only are they lending the money in your check account, but a multiple of that. By lending so much, that puts downward pressure on interest rates that people see for their mortgages. The lower the rate of interest, the greater the loans they have, the more incentive they have to rush off and put upward pressure upon those prices. So the effect then, by staving off, by creating a boom, the artificial boom has to do with things like the stock market, real estate. At the moment, massive expenditure on mining on the premise that somehow the laws of economics don't apply in China. What's occurred in Europe and America and elsewhere, somehow it can never happen in China. So a huge amount of investment happening. hence my argument that it's not that recessions and depressions are good. It's that given these poor policies I've mentioned, recessions become necessary. Ultimately, all of us who've committed these financial and economic sins, they're corrective devices. Mm-hmm. We have to repent for our sins. We have to say, gee, we've done bad. Here's how we've done bad. We have to clean up these bad investments and resolve to do better next time.
So this is the moral hazard we've often heard about in the headlines.
That's right.
But all the commentators are saying there's a problem here that the people who did it have avoided their moral hazard. The people that generated the fraud in the first place in the United States, in Europe and England, the cause of what we call the global financial crisis, have all been underwritten by the federal government. By the United States government.
That's right. They've been underwritten, and as you mentioned a minute ago, they've been rewarded.
So they're able to avoid moral hazard because they're powerful, Chris Leithner.
Avoid it, and indeed they have every incentive not just to repeat their mistakes, but make the same mistakes on an even bigger scale next time. So that if it was last time a real estate bubble in America, this time is it going to be, if you like, a government bubble. But if you're a banker and you basically realize, gee, I'm this big, whatever I do, I'm going to be bailed out, you haven't the slightest incentive to recognize that, gee, we done bad. Let's carefully examine exactly what has gone wrong. Let's trace these things back to their proper roots. But to trace things back to their proper roots, to abandon the definitions of money, the practices which we've adopted, suddenly then we have to realize, well, gee, most of what's occurred in financial terms over for the better part of a century has led us down this bad path. Real reform, not Obama reform, which is basically more of the same of George W. Bush, bigger deficits, more dropping of bombs on women and children, but real reform, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. Just as a person at the AA meeting, it's incredibly difficult to stand up in front of one's peers and say, I, John Doe, am an alcoholic. That's not an easy thing to do. Far easier for politicians to push the tin can a bit further down the road to make what already is a very big problem even bigger for the next several years.
It's crunch time this month in the United States, and that fact, isn't it? We'll come to that in just a moment. My guess is Chris Leithner. So your argument is that genuine prosperity or value for money arises out of liberty and freedom, of people freely engaging in trade. Mm-hmm. Now, we sort of call that capitalism in simple terms. But how do you then explain China, which is the world's biggest example of authoritarian capitalism, where it's central planning? I've had different people describe it to me as of communism with a capitalist face. Some people have said, no, have a close look at it. It's actually a new form of fascism. But how do you explain China? If prosperity arises out of liberty, and that's a very common idea in the West, how do you explain China where prosperity has arisen out of government control and direction?
Am I allowed to mention the SBS on the ABC?
Of course.
Are you sufficiently
Of course,
cognate
go, yes,
such that
go, you can mention whatever you want.
There was, I think it was on Dateline, roughly a fortnight ago, an absolutely fascinating documentary. It was so fascinating, I found the transcript on the internet a day or so later. Among the startling facts and figures, which I corroborated for myself, there are, count them, 63 million empty flats in the People's Republic of China. My answer to your question is that this is a Potemkin village prosperity in China. Repeating a point I made a few minutes ago, it is not the case that the laws of economics somehow ceased to exist within China. That China is repeating on an even bigger scale, in a more egregious form, these malinvestments which existed in the United States, in Europe, elsewhere, including Australia, mining and other sorts of investment. Their bust will be an absolutely massive one. Gargantuan numbers of flats and houses whose builder, the people who construct them, the workers, can never afford to live in them. There's a quote, I've got it close but not exactly, but reverberates in me, that it compared these massive malinvestments to the modern equivalent of building pyramids in ancient Egypt. It doesn't add to the betterment of people's lives, but it does add to the growth of GDP. So the idol which we're worshipping, among the idols we worship today, is the false god of GDP.
Gross domestic product.
Gross domestic product. Mm-hmm. After the tsunamis, after the earthquake in Japan, including and also in Christchurch, there'll be people who say extraordinarily dumb things to the effect of, but that's going to increase GDP.
Yes.
And they quickly say, "Oh, but we're certainly not minimising the human tragedy and whatnot." But it's patently absurd that not just lives, but capital, homes, factories, etc., in Christchurch and in Japan have been destroyed. To destroy lives and capital is to render a country poorer. If GDP rises as a result of that, it shows how inane the concept and the measurement of GDP actually is. But what your listeners would intuitively know, what, alas, some of them have experienced, is that to lose your house is to become poorer. An insurer can perhaps make you not completely square, can replace the house, but it mightn't be exactly the same house of exactly the same quality which you previously inhabited. The wedding photos are gone, the photos of the kids as infants, those have been destroyed. No one's kidding themselves in the real world that that's a tragedy and that they're poorer. It's only mainstream economists who have the absurd sort of a notion that, the number of houses, for the sake of argument, has gone from 100 down to 90, but because now it's going to increase from 90 back to 100, that percentage growth from 90 to 100, well, hang on, there's no more houses. The country is no better off. Ask the economist the next time he tells you that, the country can be better off in a GDP sense. Let's all take cricket bats and destroy the house of the economist and see how he likes it. To say, look, by your own reckoning, society now is better off. You should be the first to volunteer your house to go under the sledgehammer and see how you like it when your house is destroyed.
So China has how many empty apartments that have been built?
According to Dateline, I went to the website, 63 million.
63 million apartments and more being built in China.
All the time.
Awaiting to be sold.
Awaiting to be, who knows? They haven't been sold. They lie empty. By and large, they can't be sold for the simple reason that the bulk of the Chinese population is not wealth enough to afford them.
Okay, so your point is that this is
that's not wealth.
One of the biggest asset bubbles in the history of human civilization.
Yes.
And bubbles eventually burst, as we've just learned in the global financial crisis.
Correct. The laws of economics do not stop when one enters into Chinese airspace.
So your point is that while we might all look in amazement at the authoritarian capitalism model of China, the prosperity arises out of liberty, but what they're building is an asset bubble, not genuine wealth.
An analogous point, not exactly the same point, but roughly 25 years ago, there were 747s packed with economists and strategic management types, gurus going to Japan, saying that Japan is the way of the future, Japan is clobbering the West, Japan is the way to go.
I remember that very well in the late 80s.
Less well known, economists want to hide it, and they know history like the back of the moon, that's to say they ignore it. But in the mid to late 1930s, American mainstream economists trooped across to Hitler Germany to say that, this is the way of the future. Adolf Hitler he's eliminated unemployment, people there at work and so on. By May of 1945...
You all studied that in history, yes,
yep,
they did.
There are, for the mainstream, extraordinarily uncomfortable and, dare I say it, extremely embarrassing, but they're not embarrassed because they never look at it, parallels between Hitler Germany, his economic policies, and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. I make the point, therefore, that whether it's Japan in the 80s, the New Deal in the mid to late 30s, China today, these non-market, third-party interventionist sorts of things come unstuck.
Your point is, Chris, that we just keep repeating the mistakes of history, keep pretending that we can avoid them if we tweak here and adjust there, but we keep repeating it.
That's right. There's no such thing as Christian economics, but it seems to me theology has a lot to teach economists. First and foremost, that there's no such thing. There are no secrets. Gnosticism goes out the window. How does one create wealth? First of all, by savings, which means by constraining one's consumption, taking that saved surplus, investing it in productive capacity, producing goods and services. One therefore has more goods and services, which because there are more goods and services, they become cheaper. Poorer people can thereby afford them, and it's by those means that society becomes richer. But that takes time and it takes effort, namely savings. Australia cannot borrow and spend its way to prosperity. Like any other country, it can only save and invest and produce its way to prosperity.
This is one of the solutions. I haven't really given enough time for some what you describe as modest proposals in your book for solutions, but one of your key ones is that we actually need to save money to build genuine capital and savings.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct.
Now, and economists are lamenting that at the moment because it's slowing down the economy, Chris.
Because they tell you that it is consumption. But ask the economist, okay, mate, why don't you empty your check account overnight and you'll find that you're not going to be able to pay the bills next week and next month. And they'll say, oh, hang on, there's a difference between the actions of an individual and the actions of a collectivity, which raises the question, well, at what stage does one cross that boundary? When we get off of Crusoe's island, you have to have 6 people. Is it a dozen people by which somehow these laws cease to apply? But the same laws apply to each individual. It is your savings properly invested. You get whether it's a dividend stream, a profit stream, the added production reduces the price of goods. And so in a healthy economy, much as existed in the 19th century, the purchasing power of the currency increased. That's to say goods and the prices of goods and services fell. So that when you walk into a supermarket, Steve Austin, do you think, oh, the price of mince has gone from $12 a kilo to $10 a kilo, woe is me? Or do you say, well, I like making risole, so let's fill up the freeze? In other words, falling prices are good things, except if you're Ben Bernanke. Right?
Yes.
What every consumer knows to be obvious, and so obvious it's absurd even to mention it, that the lower the price, the greater you can stretch your dollar. But the world's central bankers flatly would dispute that and deny it. They want to prop up prices. They want to prevent this corrective mechanism. They want to prevent us from recognizing they want to stop themselves from recognizing their financial and economic sins. They certainly want us.
No, they want economic growth, Chris Leithner. They often say that. They want economic growth.
They want the GDP figures to rise. We've just mentioned that. That's not the same thing as the wealth of a society, the well-being of members of society rising. That we are governed by people who have feet of clay and soft heads.
Chris, you in the book, right in the very beginning, say, look, you've set out to deliberately provoke in this book, to annoy, because you essentially the book argues that we're repeating all of the mistakes of history and not learning that basic wealth comes from genuine production and savings and quite basic fundamental things.
That's right.
And at the moment, sort of journalists and others like me are missing this point. That we say, gee, why did that global financial crisis happen? When if we look back in history, we already had the reasons why it happened, and we just get blinded by something.
That's right. If anything, the question should become, why did this most recent one take so long to happen? It seems to me the question is not why did it happen. It's the latest incidents in a series of crises. In the book I mentioned the panic of 1907, depression in 1908. After the First World War, a severe depression by any standard you might want to shake a stick at. What did the US government do? It let interest rates rise drastically. It slashed its budget by a third. No one remembers the depression of 1920, 1921. Why? Because by 1922, the recovery was well in train. Economists don't want to talk it. They've never heard about it or learnt about it. But how was that depression cured? By the absolute polar opposite methods that are used today.
I have to go. I have to wind it up. But if China is in a massive housing bubble, why hasn't it burst already? If there's 65 million empty apartments there and more being built, when does the bubble go bang?
If you ask a volcanologist when is the earthquake going to occur, he can say, look, we can show you signs, we can show you symptoms, but we can't give you a precise time. Economics is a much more primitive science than the real respectable physical sciences. So I wish I could answer that question.
Okay.
I can't.
Chris, thanks for coming in.
Great pleasure.
Chris Leithner has authored The Evil Princes of Martin Place, The Reserve Bank of Australia, The Global Financial Crisis and the Threat to Australians' Liberty and Prosperity.